This is the Authority Company Podcast, conversations with leaders that are designing our future. Hola, I'm Joe Pardavila, and my guest today is Dave Blivin, the founder and managing director of Cottonwood Technology Funds. For more than 30 years, Dave's been helping hard science startups grow in places far from Silicon Valley, from the U.S. to Europe. He's also the author of the new book, Crossing the Cactus, a blueprint for tech commercialization success outside Silicon Valley, where he shares a plan for building innovation ecosystems in regions most people overlook. Dave, welcome to the podcast. How are you?
I'm good, Joe. Thanks for having me. Appreciate your interest in the book, and I look forward to talking about it and seeing where the conversation goes.
But ditto, Dave. And so I want to start by talking about how when I started doing business podcasts about 5 years ago, this shift of when I talked to startups and entrepreneurs in 2020, everyone was based in basically Northern California, Silicon Valley. And then right around then, the pandemic happened, and then you saw people spray across the country. But you've seen this shift now that more and more, Dave, when I speak to an entrepreneur or startup founder, they're not in Silicon Valley. They're in Austin, or they're in Nashville, or they're in Pittsburgh. They're in all these other cities you would not expect to be startup hubs. And that's sort of where you come from. We're writing the book, Crossing the Cactus. Tell me about how you've seen this shift over your career, where it's not just, even me as an old media person, it was New York and LA. Now it's not New York and LA anymore. Now it's, again, going back to those other cities, Austin and Nashville, that people are creating media out of. So tell me about the shift that you've seen over the course of your career.
Yeah, well, to be honest, in terms of what the book's about, these entrepreneurs and these ideas have been everywhere for a long time. But they're not necessarily easily discovered or easily supported. And that's sort of what the book is about, of course, right? It's like you've got the centers of innovation really everywhere. Every state has a leading research university or multiple. If you take New Mexico, we've got 3 leading research universities, plus 2 national labs. I'm in Denver now. We've got the National Renewable Energy Lab and 3 research universities. But it's true in every state, and it's true in every country. We have an office in the Netherlands and Europe, and several really leading research universities, top innovation, national centers of innovation. So these ideas have been everywhere for a long time. To your point, you don't necessarily see a lot of success stories coming out of these different regions. Partly, a lot of the best ideas leave the region. Either they get licensed to big companies. So if you're at a University of New Mexico or Colorado or Nebraska, you might naturally look to General Motors or Google or, Facebook or Cisco and license your best technologies to those companies so they don't create jobs where the innovation occurred. Or even if you start a company, and this has been true for a lot of our companies even, we've backed a number of companies in New Mexico, for example. When we recruit the CEO, quite often it's someone who's not based in New Mexico. In fact, pretty much every case, it's been someone not based in New Mexico, even though great innovation exists in New Mexico. And so the company ultimately kind of migrates out of New Mexico over time as they build the rest of their management team and start to scale the business. And so even though the company might have started, even though we might have invested in the company when it was in New Mexico, might not end up being known, if you will, as a success story for New Mexico, because by the time it's successful, it might have relocated to California or, one of these innovation centers, and not so much the innovation centers, but the capital centers, right? So where is the money? Where is the management? And that's what this book is about is, rather than have the best ideas, leave your community, and go to where the money and the management is. How do you bring the money and the management to where the ideas are and get the benefit of this innovation? Keep the ideas there, grow the companies there, create the jobs there, create the economic windfall there, and then get a repeatable kind of critical mass that can be built over time and scaled over time to a much bigger success. So you got to start somewhere. It's not going to happen overnight, and that's kind of what this book is about.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned because the way you're describing is because for years it's always bring the horse to the water. But what a lot of these startups and companies were doing is they're bringing the water to the horse. They were essentially saying like, hey, listen, we're starting in New Mexico or we're starting in Denver, but like, hey, If we want to get to the capital centers, it's let's go to Silicon Valley, let's go to Northern California, let's do that. So what are you doing, and the way this book helps people, but how are you doing to help these entrepreneurs not have to make that leap, like the one you described, where they're starting in New Mexico but then going to Michigan or another capital center? Tell me about the steps that entrepreneurs can take, and maybe the way you're helping them prevent them from having to do that.
Well, and part of this book is focused at what I'll call public policy, right? So if you're the governor of Colorado or New Mexico or Iowa, and your objective is to identify some of the compelling innovation in your community, but then keep it there, grow it there, et cetera, or even any country, right? Like the Netherlands or Germany or France. I mean, this is true everywhere. I mean, if you talk to any president of any country, any governor of any state, any mayor of any city, they're going to talk about tech commercialization as a pathway to job creation and economic diversification. But what they try to then do is say, well, let's go to Silicon Valley and see how they did it in Silicon Valley, and we can try to repeat that. Well, that's not really, I mean, that's a natural thing to think, but trying to execute on that is not really possible. And so what happens, and I think, what I found over time, when I first got into the venture business, I would talk to other folks in the venture business from Boston or from California, where to your earlier point, that's where most of the money is and was and has been for a long time. And it's like, well, how do you decide how to invest in different companies? What's your criteria? And the general answer is money follows management. So if you got a good manager, they can raise money. But when you're in a lot of these innovation centers that don't have the history, and to my earlier point about New Mexico, when we recruit CEOs, the management may not naturally be in your community if there hasn't been a history of successful companies started and grown and taken public or sold. Um, and so you'd like to follow management, but when you're in these regions with these compelling ideas, if you want to keep them there, again, a lot of times maybe the ideas move to the management or move to the money. But if your objective as public policy is to keep the ideas in region, you have to solve for one of those two things. So let's just assume, and this is part of the thesis of the book, there's a great idea in your state, in your city, in your country, multiple. That's almost a given. That's been my experience. And so now you have two other criteria or resources that you need. One is money, one is management. And what I found, and this is sort of what our approach at Cottonwood has been as a result of this, is yeah, money can follow management. That's the traditional formula. But what if you think differently and you think maybe management can follow money? And so what we did originally in the Southeast, and now I'm doing in the Southwest and in Europe, is let's get management to follow money. And the way you have to do that from an execution standpoint is you have to put more money in earlier. So traditional approach to seed, pre-seed, is angel, family office, high net worth led rounds, 250 to 500,000 as an initial investment amount. And on the soft tech side, like to your earlier comment about, people are everywhere today, it's more true, obviously with the internet and all that, it's more true in software companies because you don't have to have a physical location necessarily. Like with the hard tech company, which is kind of our focus and a primary focus of the book, you need a lab, you need a manufacturing facility, you need it can't all be done virtually. And that's where the potential for job creation in your community is that these companies actually do need people physically located next to the ideas, and they have to build a company that actually produces something. So it can't all be done virtually. And so with 500,000 even, you might move the product forward, you might move customers' interest forward. But when you go to raise the next round is going to look at who's the manager. And so it gets back to what I was saying, money follows management. And so ultimately it does get to that when you get to the next rounds. And so you can kind of bridge that by putting in more money earlier, trying to solve the management issue earlier and try to get them to reside in your community. And so instead of 250 to 500,000, we're putting in 2 million, even at this early stage. So we have the ability to recruit management. I mean, we need the time to build something, but we also really need a manager that the next round of investors will bank on and be willing to invest, say 5 to 10 million on the next round, when the first round might be 2 to 4 million.
Wow, that's great. It's funny. I was just reading this morning, and you mentioned public policy, and I'd love to pick your brain on this. Not necessarily what you write about in the book, but the Wall Street Journal wrote this article about how for years Disney Marvel invested millions and millions of dollars of growing the film industry in Atlanta, and
Yep.
the state of Georgia gave amazing rebates to all these productions that were coming into town. Then all of a sudden, Europe says, "Knock, knock, knock, Hollywood. You know what you're doing there in Atlanta? We can do it cheaper for you in Scotland and London." And then all of a sudden, an entire industry has been uprooted from the major southern city of the United States to Europe because of these public policy decisions, because maybe Georgia couldn't keep up with the rebates or allow the rebates that they were getting.
It's funny that you bring that up, because I have a whole section of the book talking about the film industry in New Mexico. But the preamble to that, I was in North Carolina, focus on the Southeast. North Carolina thought it was going to be the Hollywood of the East. And what they did is probably what Georgia did, which was provide incentives. But if incentives is all you have, other people can provide better incentives, to your point. And so one thing that's made New Mexico sort of a sustained success in the film industry is, yes, they provided incentives, but they also did a lot of other stuff in terms of workforce development, studio development, post-processing capabilities. They inventoried like the whole state for site location for movies. And that resulted in Netflix committing $10 billion in film production to New Mexico. And then that was followed by NBC Universal committing like $2 billion. But that took like 10 years, right? It took a sustained effort of not just providing incentives, but thinking long-term and creating real capabilities. So you're coming to New Mexico not just because it's cheap and you can get rebates, but because it's also got the talent and the resources and the trained workforce to really do it cheaper, on top of, and maybe better in a lot of cases. So that gets exactly to your point is, if all you're going to do is provide incentives, you might get a short-term win because your incentives are better than somebody else's. Someone's going to come in and trump you. So you have to have more than just an incentives plan.
Wow, and famously, the New Mexico film industry blew up. For many people remember, Bruce Breaking Bad was sort of like the first one to break through, pardon the pun, to bring production. And do you think the idea of great point about the fact that if it's not just the incentives,
Right.
is geography have something to do with the fact that Albuquerque is a pretty short jump from Hollywood? So maybe it's even not that, I mean, not that, Atlanta and even North Carolina are like in the middle of nowhere, but just its proximity to California. You think it lends itself that talent could easily fly in and out of the city,
Well, I
or
don't
no?
know. I mean, a lot of places are even closer, right? Phoenix or Salt Lake City. So I don't know it's so much about geography. I think it's more about having a complete business plan, having a strategy that includes branding, includes incentives, but includes workforce development, includes asset development, and the expertise um, to really be a legitimate center for production, not just a cheap place to do business.
Yeah. The workforce element reminds me of this sort of argument that Apple has sort of been carrying over the last couple of years about bringing manufacturing to the States,
Right.
because their main argument is, hey, we've spent the last 20 years training Asia how to
Right.
make these phones. How could we possibly do that, eh, build here in the United States, and then on top of that, pay these people more who don't even have anywhere near the experience of what the people in China and Asian countries are doing with their technology. So that workforce element, I think, for many people goes over their head, because like, oh, it's the if we build it, then the workers will come. But it's
Right.
all about the right workers, right, Dave?
It's the right workers. Also, I think, What was sort of outsourced was the commodity kind of stuff, right? Just to make millions and millions of the same thing. Um, the whole environment today has changed so much in terms of rapid innovation and advanced manufacturing. And so just sticking up a line and running millions of parts through for the next 10 years is not what happens anymore. It's changing almost, annually for sure, maybe more than once a year. So, having the capability, I think that's where the U.S. lends itself to sort of advanced manufacturing, advanced technology, innovation, rapid, what do they call iterations, et cetera, et cetera. So, which again still requires trained workforce, right? And so I think that's where you've got a lot of momentum of kind of reshoring. And then partly, I think that I don't know if the economics have run out on foreign manufacturing, but I think the trade-offs are certainly shifting back in our direction.
And there's always been this sort of uh, dark cloud over the fact that manufacturing can never survive here in the United States as it is in other places because we talk about the workforce, the cost of labor.
Right.
Are you more bullish on it now? Maybe it could be because of the tariff situation, anything else. Are you more bullish on manufacturing here in the United States? And I've had this conversation with people before, Dave, and it's that people think manufacturing is the old GM assembly line or like Laverne and Shirley, where everyone's like that sort of manufacturing that really doesn't even exist in most parts of the world. It's the technology is advanced to a certain degree that you don't have that typical, manufacturing type setup. But tell me
Right.
about how bullish you are about manufacturing here in the States.
Well, to your point, I mean, manufacturing more and more and more is highly automated, highly robotic driven, right? So you have less and less people. And so again, the more you take people out of the equation, that was the main argument for, going to Asia or whatever was the low cost of labor as much
Yeah.
as anything, right? And again, you didn't need super skilled labor because it was just repetitive tasks, like you're saying. Just you sit at your chair and you put this bolt on this screw all day for 8 hours and come back the next day do the same thing. Um, those kind of jobs, are less and less. Like again, because of automation and robotics, and so it does lend itself again. From an economic standpoint that you're less dependent on cheap labor, you're more dependent on quick innovation, iteration, flexibility, and so that kind of a setup. I mean, you talk about even like I think Amazon talking about dark warehousing, right, where there's lights are off and it's just robots picking and placing and shipping and a few people making sure the electricity stays on, maybe, but um, so you get into that kind of an approach, and certainly the U.S. Can compete on the innovation with anybody in the world. And maybe the labor is a little bit more expensive, but if you don't need that much labor, you have the other trade-offs of the cost of shipping, everything else that's involved.
So, in other words, I don't mean to put words in your mouth. We can see an increase in manufacturing here, but that will not, it's not A plus B equals C. It's not manufacturing will bring more jobs here because, like you said, there won't require that many human bodies to
Right.
work at these facilities. So, in essence, yes, these companies can grow and be successful in the United States, but it's not going to be to the benefit of the mass workforce,
Well, it will be to some, but yeah, not to the scale it might have been in the past for sure.
like the
Yeah,
Industrial Revolution. We ain't seeing
yeah,
that again.
yeah, yeah. No,
Interesting.
but I mean, that's the way it is. So you got to adapt, and that's the approach that every big company today is moving in that direction. And AI is just even accelerating that further, right?
Yeah, no doubt about it. We'll get into that in a second, but I want to dig into your book a little bit because I love a good metaphor as much as anybody, and your book is swimming in metaphors. Obviously, the title "Crossing the Cactus," but the one part I want to get into is your idea of the contrast between Silicon Valley as a rainforest, another metaphor, and the deserts where most ideas originate.
Right.
How did that metaphor come to life when you were writing the book?
Well, there is a book called the Rainforest Autonomy of How Silicon Valley Grew, or something like that. And it was written by two venture capital investors in California. So I guess there's a few of us that focus on this economic impact side of things. And so they created this book, sort of drawing parallels between how rainforest grows and how Silicon Valley grew. But the false premise, in my opinion, was if you understand how Silicon Valley grew, then you can duplicate Silicon Valley wherever you are. And that's, of course, like as I said, even at the very beginning, that's sort of the natural inclination for most people is, hey, let's recreate Silicon Valley. And if we only understood how it happened, we could duplicate the set of resources and policies, approaches that would allow us to duplicate Silicon Valley. The false premise comes from, in my opinion, you start with the premise there's an abundance of resources. I mean, that's a fundamental premise of a rainforest, and that was sort of the basis of Silicon Valley initially is there's an abundance of resources. So if you have abundance of resources, you can be pretty wasteful. You can do a lot of things that don't work, and you can still be successful in the end because the chaos theory and just things kind of happen, and you can't preordain it, but it's going to happen because there's just so much of excess capacity in the system, if you will. But if you're in New Mexico or almost anywhere else in the country or in the world, you don't start with an abundance of resources. And so that's the whole analogy with the desert. It's like you're not in the rainforest. You're in a desert when it comes to the resources that you need to be successful. And if you're in any of these areas, 90% plus of what you need to be successful as a company is not based in your city or in your state, whether it's customers, whether it's money, whether it's management, et cetera, et cetera. So you have to think totally different. You can't just think, oh, we'll randomly put together the right resources and the right money. And there's so much, we can make a lot of mistakes and still end up being successful. You have to be much more kind of focused on efficient use of resources, recruiting, attracting resources to you, as we said before. And so that's the whole desert analogy. And the crossing part of it, many people in the venture business and the startup community are familiar with a book called Crossing the Chasm, which was written by a guy named Jeffrey Moore, who noticed kind of being in Silicon Valley that a lot of companies got started and got a first customer, but never migrated to a mass market in a big company. And so that book has a lot of focus around how do you bridge from a first customer to a mass market. My book is more, how do you get to a first customer? How do you get to a first product, right? How do you find these best ideas and get them supported, get them started in the direction of solving these big problems, globally, and helping build them. And again, helping think about it in a way that you can help them not only start, but stay and grow where they started, so you get the ultimate benefit of their success.
Wow. You mentioned the fact that you can't do the copycat model. You can't be like, "Hey, let's do in Idaho what they did in Silicon Valley."
Right.
But it does remind me that in certain aspects, it can work that way. And the one that I think of, and I hate to use another movie analogy, but China and Hollywood, many
Right.
years ago, when China was like, "Hey, we want to become a major player in the film industry," what they did was they got into bed with all the Hollywood studios and say, like, "We'll show your movies. Bring your filmmakers here, show us how to make these movies." And
Right.
then once they figured out how to make how to make the movies, they said, "Hollywood, goodbye. We're not going to show any of your movies anymore." And there's this great book called Red Carpet by Eric Schwartzel that
Yeah.
came out a few years ago that talks about this. How they basically said, "We're going to steal the way you guys do things, and then we're going to do that." Why can't I mean, I'm sure there could be some instances where you could bring up where it's happened. Why can't that copycat model work when it comes to the world of venture?
Well, I think, again, when you get into media or software, where there's no patents and no patent protection, there is a little bit more mobility around some of these ideas, and the ability to duplicate and copy and put more money and management behind something that's a good idea, and run over the people that maybe had the best idea but didn't have the money and management to really out execute the next company. On the hard tech side in particular, those ideas aren't everywhere. Those ideas come out of specific research activities at different innovation centers globally. And, again, at the end of the day, you can move those ideas, right? So you can license the technology out of the University of Nebraska to Cisco and move the idea and create the jobs in Silicon Valley or whatever. Um, so they are mobile in the sense that you can license them and take advantage of them, but they're not as mobile in terms of the ability to duplicate. In terms of, these are ideas that took decades in most cases to be discovered. The people that are working on these ideas, there's a lot of trade secrets, so you can't just read the patents and throw up a company tomorrow and figure it out if you don't really have the right people. And so usually they do have a true head start and a proprietary approach that's not easily duplicated. So, again, at the early stages, they can be moved, when it's the technology and you're just getting a license, or there's 2 or 3 founders and, they're willing to move to California or wherever money or management might be that thinks it's a compelling idea. I mean, that's where you're at risk initially as a community of losing your best ideas. But then again, as we talked earlier, you're also at risk later as they start to build their teams. And so I think, one of the things I try to point out in the book is, it's not just about finding these ideas, helping them get started. Maybe they got started in, Lincoln, Nebraska. But then as they grow and they start to build their team, are they going to stay there? And how do they recruit people to come to Lincoln, Nebraska? And how do they recruit money to continue to come and support the company in Lincoln, Nebraska? And so is that Lincoln, Nebraska's problem or Nebraska's problem in general? You could say, no, it's, the company, it's up to the company to solve all those problems. But if the company's going to solve all those problems, the likelihood is they're going to leave Nebraska. So if you want to keep the company in Nebraska or any of these communities that are emerging innovation centers, you do have to be proactive from a public policy standpoint of thinking about how do you make it easy for them to stay, because there's competition. I mean, everybody would like those companies, right? Once they get to a certain point, um, and they're going to be successful, there's a lot of people that would like to, see them move and create jobs there, right? So if you just let that happen, you maybe even invested in a lot of innovation that created these companies that you never get the full return on investment by not thinking about the full life cycle of these companies and just thinking, how do we get them started? So that's where I talk in the book a little about, it's more of a business plan, more of I think of it as a puzzle, right? So if you have a picture and you chop it up into 10 pieces, if you just have one piece, you don't have a full picture. You need all 10 pieces, right? And so in terms of a comprehensive business plan, you can't just stop at how do we support more innovation in our community by investing in our universities and creating more endowed chairs, or how do we create more startups by supporting more startup capital, or even workforce development. You have to think the full life cycle. How do we create the next round of capital available to our companies? How do we attract the next round of managers? What incentives can we provide that might entice them to move to, Nebraska or New Mexico or Colorado, et cetera? So, you can just let the market take what do they say? A free market system. So, if you just sort of rely on the free market system, I used to hear, the better mousetrap theory, right? Which was every good idea will be found. It's like, yeah, okay, maybe they will be found. Truth is they won't. But even if you assume they will, if they're found, they're most likely going to be moved out of your state or out of your city, unless you are thinking about how can we create the ecosystem that can help them stay here.
That's great. And, obviously this conversation in your book highlights the advantages of the hard tech you've been describing. And
Right.
it's funny too, because for years I've been on this, I don't know, this high horse about the fact that all these kids are spending hundreds of $1,000s going to the best schools in the country, like Harvard and Stanford, and they're going so they can create the next app. And every time I talk to like anyone, involved in entrepreneurship or startups, I'm like, doesn't that like upset you that like all these really, really smart people could probably be like solving greater problems, but they're trying to come up with the next great dating app So something that obviously what we talk about in your book shows is like these hard tech ideas, these are the sort of game changers in terms of not only helping entrepreneurs, but also helping communities and states and people around them.
Right.
How, from the investor side, is that still is that a struggle? Whereas everyone is still like you mentioned AI earlier. Is everyone's like, oh yeah, this guy who came up with this device that they're going to build in Mexico sounds great, but man, I heard about this 16-year-old kid from San Francisco's got an AI app. Let me invest in that instead. Tell me
Yeah.
about the struggle from the VC side about chasing that carrot or chasing something that could actually change the world.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think of what we're doing, and in general, the context of this book is a little bit contrarian, right? Because to your point, I mean, the venture industry really, I mean, if you accept that it started in Silicon Valley, which it did, still when it started, silicon was silicon wafers, right? And silicon chips and, real things that could be built with silicon chips in terms of computers and et cetera, now cell phones. And so you used to always hear about the Internet of Things, but you still need things. You can't do everything in software. And so, um, but the venture industry over time has shifted less about supporting, hard tech innovation and more towards, how can we scale quickly? How can we exit quickly? And that tends to take them into these what they think are like capital light. You can scale quickly with, if you look at Google or Facebook, it's not cheap um, at all, but you can start kind of cheap and kind of test the idea, gain traction. Ultimately, you need a lot of money and a lot of management to win. But you can scale more quickly. You don't have to put up a, $100 million manufacturing facility and, bet on, the customer pull for your products and all that. So there has been a tendency in the venture community to shift to more towards the soft tech, and like AI is a good example of it now, to your point. Um, and valuations rapidly, mushroom into the billions, right? If you get traction. And it's hard to do that on hard tech because you got to actually build something. You need a manufacturing facility or something. It takes money to build those. It takes time to build those. It's not going to just happen overnight. And yet, those are, to your point, ultimately the things that really move the needle in terms of whether it's in the manufacturing space, new materials that provide new capabilities, new even like AI is driven by, chips, right? These, AI chips. I mean, so you actually have to have chips. You have to have servers and data centers and, cooling systems and distribution systems. And so none of some of that's obviously software, but ultimately it's a lot of hardware too. And, so, I mean, yeah, I think it's in our case, it's frustrating in terms of when you look at the, 95% of the venture community that just wants to write checks into the next hot space, and they, they think they can make money quicker in soft tech. Um, you have a lot of compelling ideas in the hard tech space that struggle to find the next dollar. So that's shifting. I mean, I've seen, especially like we were talking about earlier, the kind of reshoring of manufacturing, and so in general, there has been a shift occurring that, especially again from a public policy government standpoint. You saw the CHIPS Act with the last administration, and so there is a shift in a kind of understanding that some of these core enabling technologies are really game changers in terms of long-term job creation and economic diversification. So there is a kind of new resources and more resources starting to shift back in this direction. So that's been helpful.
Yeah, you mentioned it in our chat, and even in the book, you talk about how sometimes finding experienced management is harder than finding capital in some of these non-legacy tech
Right.
hubs. So what do you do? Like, how do you attract these folks to like a Nebraska or something like that? I mean, it is it money? Is it? I mean, is it just what you're doing? Like, what's how do you do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a full court press. I mean, part of it is the company can do what it can do, right? It can offer a competitive pay package, but if you live in California and your last success was in California and all your friends are in California and your kids are going to school in California, you know, picking up and moving to Nebraska may not be that popular with your family even, right? A lot of times you got to sell your family more than you got to sell, everybody else. Um, so part of it is, financial. I mean, ultimately, it's almost all financial, but um, and so coming up with creative strategies. I mean, some of the things I talk about in the book is, tax incentives where maybe if you're successful in Nebraska, and move to Nebraska, you don't have to pay capital gains tax in Nebraska, and things like that. So in some, you know, I mean, taxes is a big part of it in a lot of cases. I mean, when I was in New Mexico or in North Carolina, we had a lot of our best entrepreneurs move to Florida right before they sold their company because there was no state tax in Florida. And they're like, with the money I don't pay to the state of North Carolina, I can buy a multi-million-dollar house in Florida, which is true. And now I'm in New Mexico starting Cottonwood. Well, who's right next to New Mexico? Texas, with no state income tax. So we haven't had to deal with that much because we haven't had that many huge success stories yet in New Mexico. I think we have some coming. And so I think part of it is the state recognizing again that, and this is true not just in New Mexico, but in a lot of states, politically, they have different incentive programs to help startups. And, one of them is you can get a jobs tax credit if you hire somebody from New Mexico. But if you hire somebody not from New Mexico and move them to New Mexico, you don't get that. And, in their minds, you should hire New Mexico residents before you hire somebody from outside the state. But the truth is, if you're in New Mexico, you benefit by having smart people move to the state, right? So why should it matter? And all things being equal, if that same quality of person exists in New Mexico, you would hire the New Mexico person. You wouldn't hire somebody from outside the state and try to move them to the state. So, and then they have a program called LIDA in New Mexico, which is um, kind of a slush fund for the government to recruit new companies or keep companies in New Mexico, right? So if you are thinking about moving to New Mexico, they can say, hey, we'll buy you this building. And then if you create X number of jobs, we'll forgive the debt because we're going to get paid back in terms of, tax income and things like that. Um, but buildings don't create jobs. People do, right? At the end of the day. And so, when I try to propose things that would be similar to LIDA to recruit management to move to New Mexico, you can't get support for that because you're giving money to rich people, in theory, right? But those rich people are rich because they know how to start and grow companies, and you need them more than they need you. And so if you could get them to live in New Mexico and build their next success story in New Mexico, you would be thrilled. But politically, it's hard to do.
I mean, I know we kind of touched on it earlier about the public policy and tax incentives and stuff like that. But I wonder, like, sometimes with a lot of these hard tech companies, I'm sure you've probably seen over the last year, is the fact that now all of a sudden the government is no longer giving clean energy subsidies, and the rebates on EVs are gone. So how do you thread that needle? I mean, it sounds like you're threading it now with a couple of those examples you gave in New
Right.
Mexico. But what kind of advice do you give to folks that are either in the startup or entrepreneur space or even the VC space when it comes to navigating these political landmines?
Well, I mean, for us, we try not to invest in companies that are heavily dependent on subsidies from the government.
Okay.
And so we look for ideas that are compelling in their own right, and are economical in their own right. And so if there's government subsidies for some period of time, that's icing on the cake, but it's not needed for survival, if you will. We're not banking on that because, to your point, I mean, administrations change, policies change. And if you bank on, hey, we're going to get carbon tax credits, and that's what's going to make us successful and make us profitable, and then all of a sudden, carbon tax credits are no longer part of the equation. Now it doesn't work. And so we try to focus on businesses that we think work, just with their own economics, with the market conditions as they are. And if there are government subsidies, that's just extra, but it's not a condition of success.
So in other words, it's treat companies like Thanksgiving dinner, no religion or politics, right? Just make sure you steer on making that idea is a good idea.
I mean, that's where I think, I said my background's not technology, it's business, but I think that's where, we've made investments across lots of different technology areas. But at the end of the day, I'm always focused on, is this a real business? Does it have a real business model that can compete in the market? Um, and I think that steered us clear, fortunately, of a lot of kind of hot areas that, fizzle out just because, again, the government might focus on this or that for a period of time, and people throw money in that direction. And then if the music stops, they're really stuck.
Yeah, you're losing musical chairs there. All right, you mentioned the I word a bunch, and I think I've said it too. Ideas,
Yeah.
and I've always said everybody's got ideas. It's all about the execution. I always tease my wife because my wife's one of those people that she'll see like whether it's an app or an item or like a movie, and she's like, "I had the idea for that 10 years ago." I'm like, "Well, did you do anything with it?" Because it doesn't matter. Ideas are everywhere. It's what you do with that idea. She doesn't like when I bring that up, Dave. But tell me about that in terms of like you identifying ideas that are just more than idea, that it's an executable idea.
Yeah, well, so again, we do, I mean, literally every day we get introduced to, compelling ideas all over the world. Um, I mean, for us, they have to be hard tech, they have to be early stage where we can have an impact. But then we do a lot of diligence. So we're just not saying, hey, that's really cool. We're talking to the potential customers for those ideas and getting their input, right? Like, one of our big, I would say, value adds um, and sort of our key to success is we've built a really extensive corporate network. And so every big corporation today has uh, a venture initiative or venture group within the corporation. And partly because they've quit innovating for the most part internally, their focus is on marketing and distribution, and most of their ideas are coming from outside the corporation. That's not what it was when I first got into the venture business. It used to be not invented here, and IBM or Cisco, they had thousands of engineers, and if we brought a new idea to them, their first inclination was, oh, we could probably do that ourselves. And then if they couldn't do it themselves, then they might come buy the company. Um, but today it's much different. They're not really buying technology early anymore. They are customers for technology early, which is why they have the venture groups. They want to see these new ideas get supported and available to them as customers, not necessarily to buy the companies, although that could ultimately happen as well. And so, we're talking to them in the relevant companies. When we see an idea, our first step is, okay, let's talk to our network of theoretical customers for this technology, and let's find out what they think, because they're seeing ideas from all over the world as well, and and so they can very quickly say, "Hey, this is truly unique and disruptive if it works." Like I said, most of them will say, "Oh, that won't work," and I'll say, "Okay, fine, but if it does work, uh, would it be interesting?" And so they see a lot of stuff. More than we see, right, relevant to their particular industry, and so they can give us a really good insights into, "Hey, that's not that interesting, actually." We've seen 3 other companies that are doing something that would make this obsolete pretty quickly. Um, and so, that's how we're trying to screen these ideas. I mean, part of it is, experience and having a kind of a sense for what, truly is unique with a real market opportunity. I mean, there's a lot of unique things, but the question is, does it solve a big enough problem to create a real company around it? And then the second thing is, from a competitive landscape standpoint, what are the alternatives? And one alternative is just to continue to do what you're doing. You don't necessarily need to adopt, this new technology if it's not compelling economically, right? So understanding the customers is probably our number one process in terms of, is this an idea that the logical customers for this are excited about when they start to hear about it and understand what it might do? And if they get excited, then we get excited. And then they usually won't invest at our stage because they need a prototype or a proof of concept that they can have their own engineers evaluate. Um, but they will give us that feedback. And then once we help the company build the first prototype or proof of concept, get that in the hands of the customers. Like I said, almost all of them have venture groups. And so once their engineers say, hey, this looks like it's going to work, we ought to support the company. Almost every next round of every company we've invested in includes one or more corporate venture investors. And so that's been a good path for us. And both from a diligence picking, right? So to your point, how do you decide which ones you're going to support? And then from an execution standpoint is, delivering on what we promised in terms of a working prototype or proof of concept, getting their support on the next round of funding, getting the right management in there ultimately, of course, as we discussed, is critical.
So as I always wrap up these conversations, Dave, I take folks behind the dedication of the book, and you dedicate it to your wife, who
Yep.
inspires me every day. Of all the people, I dedicate my book to my wife too, but like of all the people, why did you decide to dedicate the book to your beautiful wife?
Well, she runs her own nonprofit, and so we both kind of started. I had a venture fund when we met, but I restarted in New Mexico. She started a nonprofit around workforce development, and we've each built conferences together over time, and so we kind of feed off each other and drive each other to make an impact. And so, this has been a book that's been on the shelf in my head for a long, long time, and I finally decided, okay, now it needs to get out of my head and on paper. And she had written a book, and so that's sort of like, okay, if you can do it, okay, it's time for me to do it. So we're a good team, and she's really been super supportive through this whole journey.
Awesome. The book is Crossing the Cactus, a blueprint for tech commercialization success outside Silicon Valley. His name is Dave Blivin. Dave, thanks so much for the time. I really appreciate it.
Very good. Thanks, Joe.
And that's going to do it for this episode. If you want to find out more information about Dave and our other amazing authors, go to theauthoritycompany.com.